I will be talking about Africa's financing needs, the SDR allocation and its uses so far, and where Africa is currently. I would also speak on the systemic issues that follow SDR allocation and where African voice and influence lies in the decision making on SDR. And I would also look at what an African position should be regarding SDRs, and then open up for more discussion. So Africa's financing needs are quite large and urgent and varied as a result of the issues that it faces. So one of the biggest issues African country faces regarding its financing need, its high level of unsustainable debt, and countries that are going into debt distress. So far, 40% of African countries are running very high risk of debt distress. This is also in addition to the Russian-Ukraine crisis and to COVID recovery from the COVID pandemic. In addition to this, there have been forecasts that Africa's growth rate is going to slow down as a result of the Russian-Ukraine crisis effect that is contributing to high costs of living, import costs, global market volatilities. And there's also very increased fiscal deficit as a result of Africa's issues, which is creating increases for its financing need. So far, Africa's financing need for the next 2 years has been estimated to be over about over 400 billion, and its usual sources of financing, which include DRM from taxes, private borrowing, official development assistance, do not look very feasible because of the policy and financing costs associated with these sources. So far, Africa has more recourse or needs more recourse to special drawing rights, and that is where the fix comes in. Special drawing rights allocation criteria do not work for African countries because of the quota-based system of allocation, which ensures that high-income countries receive more of these allocations than low-income countries. And so that leaves Africa in a big fix, because we see from the 2021 SDR allocation that just only 5% of it went to African countries, which was about 33 billion, which is not enough to support economic recovery from COVID, talk less of meeting Africa's development needs. So for these reasons, and because of the huge and urgent financing needs of Africa, Africa is calling for reforms at the global level and larger SDR allocation. Please, next slide. So what are SDRs? So SDRs are an international reserve currency that were created by the IMF. And so the major purpose of SDRs is to provide liquidity to the global economy in times of financial crisis where there are liquidity constraints. So for this purpose, SDRs can be used for a lot of purposes. So it can be used for settling balance of payment problems. It can be used for budget financing. It can also be used to increase official reserves of countries. So overall, the purpose of SDR is to help the IMF meet its mandate of monetary stabilizing the economy or the global financial system, as well as bolstering economic resilience in times of crisis. So overall, like I mentioned, the SDR allocation is based on quota shares in the IMF, which is based on countries' contribution determined by its GDP size. So GDP size is, of course, it's reflective of the country's relative economic position in the global economy. So it means that the more income or the larger the GDP size of a country, the higher its SDR. Which creates a problem, because most of these high income countries like the G20 and G7 countries don't really have need for the SDRs, because particularly for the G7 countries, most of them are the issuers of the reserve currencies on which SDR is exchanged for and valued at. And in addition to that, most of the high-income countries already, in times of crisis, are able to engage in expansionary monetary policies that provide fiscal space and provide and help their citizens meet the issues that come from financial crisis. Unfortunately, African countries do not have that kind of privilege, and it's a problem. So please, next slide. So overall, SDR issuance, the IMF has issued four general SDRs and one special SDR. Some were issued in the 70s and early 80s. However, post 2000, there has been two issuances, except of course for the special one. So the first post 2000 issuance of SDR came because of the global financial crisis of 2009. 8 to 2009 to inject liquidity into the global economy. And then we have the largest SDR allocation of 650 billion, of which Africa just got 33 billion out of it, which is the size gotten from by France and Italy alone. That's what one continent got. So what are the issues? What are the systemic issues what have been the uses of this SDR that Africa has received? Next slide. So there have been several uses of the SDR allocation Africa received. So several countries have used some of their SDR to meet debts, obligations, and related expenses. Some have used it to augment shortfalls or to finance budgets. For example, countries like Cabo Verde used its SDR to finance its 2022 and 2023 budget. Some of the SDRs have been allocated to regional DFIs. Some other countries like Angola have used their SDRs to pay for imports and to bolster their foreign reserves. Countries like Zambia have used it to bolster their foreign reserves. So from the SDR allocation Africa has received, it has drawn a lot of, it has exchanged it and it's dwindled. So as at 2022, what is left of the SDR is about 4 billion, since the African countries have used their SDR. So it means that there's liquidity constraints for Africa, in addition to poor growth rate and dwindling fiscal resources. So Africa is between a rock and a hard place, essentially. So from the SDR allocation, from the uses of Africa's SDR allocation, we see certain clear patterns here. So the SDR allocation for Africa is reflective of the inequalities that exist at the global system. So in other words, bigger African countries got more SDRs than small or low-income countries. So for example, a combination of South Africa, Nigeria, and Egypt got about 30% of the allocation given to Africa, and the rest were shared among African countries. And we also see that SDR allocations are more impactful in low-income countries of Africa than the middle-income countries like Egypt and Nigeria and South Africa. So, for example, most of the SDR received by Zambia, which was used to bolster its official reserves, were much more meaningful and impactful to Zambia's official reserves than, for example, Egypt, that the difference was just about 6% in increment of its official reserves. So 1 year after, Africa still finds itself in a bind, still suffering from high debt levels and debt distress. The very devastating effect of and compounding effect of Russian-Ukraine conflict and climate change. And why is this so? Why does SDR not work for Africa? It's because of certain systemic issues that foster inequality that are at play. Please, next slide. Sorry, can you go back? Some of these systemic issues that are at play with at SD, in SDR, Africa's SDR allocation is number one, Africa does not have a voice where SDR allocations are being, or discussions are taking place at the global level. And why does Africa not have a voice? It's because the global system has been designed to be that way, starting with the quota system that SDR allocation is based on, which is reflective of GDP size. And we all know that GDP size is reflective of trade, and Africa doesn't really contribute so much to global trade because of its lack of beneficiated product it trades in, which essentially is low value compared to most developed countries that trade in finished products. Another issue that Africa faces, it's the quota size determines the voting rights and voting power of countries. So far, because Africa's quota shares in the IMF is based on contribution, Africa doesn't really contribute so much to the IMF fund and to the IMF, and as a result of its high debt levels, it also diminishes its ability to have its quota shares increased as well. So this affects its voting rights, and so far Africa is not able to, to speak through its votes. Unlike the US that has about 16% quota share votes, and together with the EU and the United Kingdom can come together to form voting blocs and influence policies on, or influence decision on SDR allocation. So this limits Africa. Africa also doesn't have sufficient representation in the executive board of the IMF to contribute or to hold or to have very important sway over decisions. So far, Africa just has 2 seats at the IMF, compared to countries like Germany and essentially the G7 countries, where most of them have a seat each. So this arrangement works against African countries. And we also see that African countries also do not have their currencies in the basket, the SDR basket of currencies. So in other words, countries that hold or offer reserve currencies have a lot of sway and they have a lot of influence. And as a result of the influence they hold, and they are able to issue money, they are able to have ample fiscal space to make decisions, then it also affects they are able to make decisions that bind Africa. So in other words, Africa's position in decision making for SDR allocation is practically non-existent. So what does this bode for Africa? Africa is a rule taker, essentially. It's not a rule maker. And so this leads us to what can be done. What should be a common African position if we want to see changes for SDR allocation? Please, next slide. So one, of course, the first position is the SDR of 2021 was useful, but it's grossly insufficient. So there will be need to channel more of unused SDRs to African countries, which there has been calls for. So one of the means I would advocate for is using it through existing African institutions instead of using it, channeling this through the RST, the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, or creating new trusts to deal with this. Also, there has been discussions on the reallocation of or redistribution of unused SDR to the tune of 100 billion by some African governments, and the UN and some civil societies are for 3 trillion. So I prefer to align myself with the UN and the civil society's point that there should be enlarged allocation or redistribution of SDRs to that amount. But these redistribution and rechanneling unused SDRs are just a part, or I would call them medium-term solutions. The best and the most important solution will be a reform of the SDR architecture. I know in the morning, one of the speakers talked about not using the reform language. Instead, there should be a total dismantling of the global system, whatever position would be taken, but there's need to discuss on how SDRs are being allocated. Perhaps one of the proposals should be expanding the criteria for SDR allocation, because this quota-based system is not working. So expansion should look at GDP, looking at development criteria for allocation of SDR. There should also be a criteria looking at growth potential, which Africa has huge growth potential because of its resources, its human resources, its natural resources. And there should be allocation criteria should also expand to needs-based or utility-based criteria. Also, there's need to for Africa on its own, because to whom much is given, much is expected. So like a lot of the speakers and the participants have spoken to, there's need for systemic reform or the legal framework on SDR usage that ensures transparency and accountability, because that's one of the issues that affect SDR allocation, or what the high income countries are saying, that there's no accountability mechanism to see how SDRs are used. Then there's also need to allocate SDRs through the, like I mentioned, African institutions. So some of them should be the African Multilateral Development Bank, which would help it to meet its function of providing loans to African government and meeting its development agenda. So some of these institutions can include the African Development Bank, the regional banks, banks like Afrexim Bank. So they will be able to channel these SDRs to African countries, because they are intimately aware of the issues that are in Africa and are able, are better positioned to provide technical assistance and institutional help to African countries. So that's the position African country finds itself. Next slide, please. So why does Africa, for the interest of time, I'll just take two. Why does Africa need SDR allocation increase, reform, or possibly dismantling of the system to create a better and more equitable system? First of all, discussions or giving stronger commitments to SDR increase and allocation at the global level helps to put Africa at a more active role in its decision and in its development. So it takes Africa from the realm of always being a rule taker to the realm of being a rule maker, or being where an active participant where rules are being taken, not just when rules taken by active members and then it's forced to toe the line of the active members. Secondly, increase or reforms around SDR allocation would help to put Africa on track again to meeting its SDGs and development agendas like the Agenda 2063. It will also help to tackle climate change, relief, and provide relief and liquidity for Africa to meet its recovery goals and other development goals. So in conclusion, I would leave by saying that the issue of SDR increase and allocation to meet Africa's financing need at this point in time has gone beyond an African problem. It's no longer an African problem. It's a developing world problem. It is a global problem. So it is time for decision makers and other stakeholders in the global economy and financial architecture to listen carefully and pay close attention and reform the rules, because extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures, and these are extraordinary times that warrant extraordinary measures. And I would close my presentation on using a quote from Walt Disney that says that progress is impossible without change. So Africa and the world cannot move beyond the crisis that COVID has caused economically and the effect of the Russian-Ukraine war without looking or changing the dynamics of things in the global system.
people first.